Welcome everyone to session 2 of our series on exploring the gospel during Lent. And today we're focusing on the passage where Jesus instructs his followers, take up your cross. So as last week and as in years past, our familiar pattern is to have some brief input on elements of the passage and then discussion questions. We've got a lot of discussion questions in today's study because there's a lot of issues raised, and we'll do some of them in breakout rooms and some of them together as a plenary group. So we're exploring in this session the teachings of Jesus, which he gave his disciples in the middle of Mark's gospel. And this passage comes between two high points of the story. The first high point earlier in chapter 8 was where Peter had confessed Jesus was the Messiah. And what follows immediately after this block of teachings is the transfiguration, where Jesus with Peter, John and James goes up a mountain to be transfigured. And so placed in the middle of those two high moments are these ominous words about what lies ahead. And just to note that although the lectionary stops at the very end of chapter 8, chapter 9 verse 1 really belongs to this section, and whoever centuries ago constructed the verse and chapter divisions made a big mistake here. So we're including 9:1 as like verse 39 of chapter 8. So the fate in store for the Son of Man, Jesus, according to Mark, appears to know exactly what is in store for him in Jerusalem. If we look at John's Gospel just for a moment, we'll see that Jesus was a little bit leery of going to Jerusalem, and indeed the disciples, according to John, did not want him to go at one point because of the danger of going there. But nevertheless, John's the Gospel that reports that he goes to Jerusalem more often than the Synoptic Gospels. So if there's any historical value in what John is saying, it is that going to Jerusalem would be a dangerous thing for Jesus. Now, Mark has Jesus state that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected, be killed, and then rise in chapter 8, but he says it again in another version in chapter 9 and again in more detail in chapter 10. These are the three sections of Mark that are known as the three passion predictions. And Mark, it seems to me, well, it seems to a lot of interpreters of Mark's gospel, that Mark has placed these predictions in a strategic place in the very middle of the gospel, the pivot between the earlier section, which is Jesus traveling around Galilee, preaching, telling parables, casting out demons, healing lots of people, and his orientation, which he starts out in chapter 10, verse 1, to go to Jerusalem, and the sequence of events, Jesus teaching in the temple, Jesus being arrested in the garden, the trial, crucifixion, and empty tomb, which is where Mark ends his gospel. So these three passion predictions are strategically placed right in that pivot section of the gospel. Now, one of the questions I think worth exploring is, did Jesus actually say these words? Because we know that Mark was writing his gospel decades after Jesus was arrested, tried, and put to death. So he writes with the benefit of hindsight, and he has Jesus described with striking clarity what indeed will happen to him. I was struck, I don't know whether any of you have watched Nemesis, but Elizabeth and I watched that series all the way through, and I was struck by a commentary of Laura Tingle about this show, where she commented that looking at Nemesis, you can see how people had choices at various times. They didn't know what was going to happen next. This contrasts, she says, with a lot of history, which speaks with the retrospective confidence that everything that happened was obvious and preordained. And the same thing could be applied to the Gospels, written well after the events they describe, that everything seems to be geared towards what God is planning. So the first enticing question for you, and Elizabeth will put you into groups, is some say that Jesus had prophetic foresight about his fate, that he was a prophet who could see what was in store for him. Others maintain that Mark, writing decades later, has attributed these words to him. What do you think, and why do you think this?
Well, how did you go with that question in your groups about whether did Jesus have prophetic foresight or did Mark attribute such things to him with the benefit of hindsight? Don't all talk at once.
No one else is going to speak. I think he didn't have foresight at all. I think this is the writer of Mark inserting material in retrospect because but by the time he was writing, the conditions were different to those that were present when Jesus was around. And they had to try and upgrade his ability, I think.
Okay, Piers has thrown out a controversial bone there, potentially anyway. Would anyone like to agree or critique?
I think the consensus in our group was that there's probably a middle ground, which is not defined by the way the question is framed, that it's not necessarily either a prophetic foresight or Mark. So Jesus could be reading his times, what's happening, and the impact of his ministry, and where the inevitability lies in terms of what's going to be happening to him. Perhaps touched, my personal thing is that probably Jesus did have good insight into his life and what was happening to him and his purpose. But also Mark is also touching up a little bit and reinforcing it by saying it 3 times.
In good Hebraic educational style, because this is, as we should always remember, an oral culture. So people aren't reading these things mostly, they're hearing them. So that's why they're so repetitive, because that's how you learn things and how you remember things, by repetition. So the middle ground in Bill's group, any other perspectives?
I was listening to By the Well this week, and Robin points out that the word must, the Son of Man must, blah, 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 is the connotation is it's an inevitability, like this thing will follow that thing, rather than a shot from above, God ordained kind of, this is what will happen.
Yeah.
And that really changed my thinking on it. I can't remember what the word was, though.
Well, that's all right.
The little word day, D-E-I.
Yeah.
Must. Yes.
It's one of those little Greek words that can have 5,000 meanings and permutations, and interpreters interpret them different ways. It is necessary, it's often interpreted.
There's a chapter in my PhD thesis on that word and how Luke uses it. Shall we?
Okay. Perhaps you and Robin should have a discussion.
No. Well, that actually leads into our next section and our next question. But
does anyone else have a comment they'd like to share?
I think, Elizabeth, that the age that this happened, even if he didn't fully understand, he must have known that it was a possibility or probability, because it was the Roman way of dealing with people.
Yes. If indeed Jesus made the choice to enter Jerusalem as the Gospels describe he did, or 4 do, the Synoptics and John, if Jesus indeed made that choice to do that, he would know how provocative that is, and there would be consequences. So whether he understood exactly what those consequences were, who knows? But if he made that choice to go to Jerusalem and act in that way, it was going to be followed swiftly by Roman wrath.
Yeah, what is the difference between insight and prophetic insight?
That's a very good question, because we tend to think of prophets as foretelling the future. Mostly they don't. What prophets do is critique current events. They critique what's going to happen now and in the immediate future. If you read Jeremiah and Isaiah and other prophets like that, you'll see that they're actually dialoguing with kings a lot of the time. And they're saying things like, if you make an alliance with this superpower, then superpower over here in the other position is going to actually come and flatten you. So it's that kind of thing that's called prophecy. That and the justice street, mishpat and tzedakah, the two Hebrew words that about doing right, doing justice, doing what God ordained you to do. The prophets talk about that. So they say your current misery is because you are not acting in a certain way. It's not like fortune tellers where they read a crystal ball and say the future is this.
Yeah. Along with what you said, Elizabeth, Jesus had, we discussed in our group about God's will in that particular situation. So the question is whether Jesus discerned the will of God at that particular time. This is going to be, he knew that if when he was facing Jerusalem, that he is going to meet a lot of opposition, even danger or death. But did he discern the will of God at that particular time when he was speaking or when he was facing Jerusalem?
Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. And maybe he did discern what he thought was the will of God, but it isn't something we can ever be 100% certain about. But it's not impossible that that's what he did. We might move on to the next section.
Yeah. So Jesus says this. Peter gets really upset by that. He rebukes Jesus. Jesus in turn rebukes Peter and calls him Satan. And he says these striking things. You have in mind the concerns of God. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That's the NIV or the NRSV. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. So this talk of suffering and resurrection and death, and maybe even resurrection, is quite shocking to Peter. But Jesus is clear that the divine things, the concerns of God, have to do with following this pathway. And perhaps we could contrast the human concerns, the human things, which is reflected in chapter 9 when the followers of Jesus argue about their status, and in chapter 10 when James and John debate and seek with Jesus the positions of power and honour on his right and left side. And indeed, also in chapter 10, where the rich man comes to Jesus but is not able to follow him because of the possessions that he clings to. So all of these things, who is the greatest, seeking possessions of honour, clinging to possessions, these may well be all manifestations of the focus on human things, whereas Jesus places himself in a vulnerable position in relation to all the human machinations that the story says are carried out against him with the Jewish authorities and then the Roman authorities. So it is through this pathway that divine things will happen. So that leads to the question that some of you have already been thinking about. What does it mean to have the death of Jesus described as a divine thing, something that God was intending? Was Jesus arrested and crucified? I'm sorry, Bill, this is another either-or question. You can work the middle ground. Was Jesus arrested and crucified because of human plotting or because of divine planning? Or somehow did the two come together?
Okay then, my good folk, how did you go with this? Did you sit on the fence in the middle? Do you think this was divinely ordained, or do you think that human plotting put Jesus on the cross?
I don't think you can say sitting on the fence. I think you could say another view.
Another view. Would you like to share it, Elizabeth?
Well, I believe that if you behave the way Jesus behaved, which was annoying the authorities and poking holes in their particular view of life, that they will try to stop you. And Jesus understood human nature extremely well. And he worked out that if he continued to heal sick people and to challenge the authority of the Pharisees and the priests, and heaven goes that they would want to put a stop to him because he was threatening their whole structure. So it was a very deep understanding, but he wasn't going to stop because the will of God was for him to keep going and doing all these things.
So it's kind of a combination of the two positions. Jesus chooses to do this, believing it to be the will of God kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
Okay.
what Gethsemane was about, really, the terrible struggle, knowing that if he kept on doing what he was doing, he was for it.
Yeah. And remember that Jesus' death was not a Jewish death, it was a Roman death.
Yeah.
The Roman authorities are the ones that crucified Jesus, which is a Roman execution.
And in Russia
The
last
Jewish
week, we saw what
authorities-
an authoritarian
Hang on.
government does.
Yeah, that's right.
Go ahead, Peter. What was that?
And in Russia last week, we understand what authoritarian governments do.
Yeah, you get in
They
their way,
kill
they crush
people.
you.
They kill people who annoy them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Piers?
Well, I was going to say the same thing eventually.
Yeah. Yes, if you're annoying enough, and particularly at certain times, which may be seen as more volatile than other times, and you bring yourself to the notice of the authorities as being insurrectionist or seditious, or, with the potential to stir up a large-scale revolt, they will crush you.
Yeah.
In room 2, we had both views, and maybe a mixture, or an intermediate view as well. That it was both. There was some had understanding that it was a divine thing, and I think that's connected to the Old Testament. And others that it was, like the inevitability of carrying on with that mission in those cultural circumstances.
One question I had, and I still haven't made up my mind exactly, but if Jesus' death wasn't divine will, how did his death atone for our sins?
That's a really good question, Sherry.
Yeah.
And many trees have been demolished to create weighty tomes trying to actually explain that, and probably none of them really agree with one another, not precisely anyway.
Yeah.
It is a really good question. And what's the
I have trouble with divine will needing that kind of sacrifice. I mean, to me, that's not godly, but it is the best example of an outpouring of love. So if you pour enough love on the wound, it will heal.
Perhaps, yeah.
I see it as a way of expressing it in terms of the Jewish tradition of sacrifice, but it's not. I mean, I can't in my culture accept that style of atonement theology.
It's very culturally bound is one answer to your question, Sherry, because that's why John has Jesus killed at the time the Paschal lambs are all sacrificed, because the idea is he's the ultimately pure and unblemished and sinless sacrifice. And the last sacrifice, if you read the book of Hebrews, which I probably don't recommend, but if you do, you will find that that's the whole thrust of that particular book, that Jesus is the last and final and complete and total sacrifice. You don't have to take a sheep or a cow or a goat or a dove now to atone for sin. Jesus did that. So that understanding comes out of the sacrificial cult of Israel. Does that help you?
Yeah, a bit, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're segueing in. Oh, sorry, did someone have something?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that given the fact that this was written at a time when there's a kind of different understanding, well, for many of a theistic God, and maybe people don't have a view of a theistic God now, it sort of puts a whole different lens on it, for me anyway.
It is a different time.
Yeah,
You're right.
I'm just a bit confused about God.
It was a time when probably atheists were very, very rare on the ground. There were some that we know of, but it was a very rare person that was an atheist. There was complete trust in this power of God or gods, to do certain things, and probably not a way that we would understand it. So you're quite right. There are some big cultural gaps there between how we see things. I mean, we've got science for a start, and we know the Earth's not flat. So, you know, there's all sorts of things that have changed for us in a post-Enlightenment scientific world that make it difficult to see it in the same way that a first century person would have.
The crucifixion actually has so many layers that it's almost like I've got many rooms. I prepared for one for you, and however you can get through your philosophy of the crucifixion is fine. I love that previous comment that you just kill everybody who's in your way, because gee, wouldn't it be annoying if anyone that Putin killed kept coming back? The ultimate state.
One of the ironies of the Pax Romana was the fact they kept peace by crushing people. So that's one of the ironies of the Roman Empire, and it was a reasonably peaceful place. But we'll move on to looking at crucifixion. And Jesus here in this passage starts to talk about he's going to find his way to the cross and he's going to be killed. So what was crucifixion? It was a punishment for disobedient slaves, because slaves are fairly much the lowest of the low, and if you rebel against your master or try and start a slaves' union to get better conditions, probably you will end up on a cross in public display, like the picture here suggests. It was for bandits, that's the people that hid in the caves and they robbed people and killed people. And it was for prisoners of war, because you're making an example of the enemy. And it was political rebels, because you're also making an example of an enemy of the state, even if it's not an enemy like, you know, the neighbouring country that you're at war with. And we have various writers from this time who talk about crucifixion or talk about what it meant. It was probably the most shameful execution that you could undergo at the hands of the Roman Empire. And that's why we had people like slaves and prisoners and bandits and seditious people, treasonous people are the ones being strung up. It was not only to shame them, and we know that Cicero talks about the ignominy of a public trial. And, you know, it's a nasty thing. Not only did it shame the person who'd committed the offence, it also was act as a salient warning to those who might be thinking of doing the same thing. And it was an example of what their fate might be. And we know Jesus in particular was quite shamed. He's mocked, he's spat on, he's flogged, he's put a fake crown on his head. He has a sign saying King of the Jews. All of these are Roman ways of shaming him and mocking him and what he stood for. So Jesus is up on this cross with two others at least that we know there. There may have been more. The Romans were capable of literally crucifying 2,000 people at a time if there'd been a big uprising or some revolt somewhere. And Jesus is here up with hardened criminals and rebels, and that's what at the time people would have identified him with. If he's humiliated by crucifixion and he's with this group of people, then the idea is to say this man is just dishonourable, he is just awful, the lowest of the low, and don't do what he did, because this is the fate that will wait for you. So there's a little bit more information there that you can have a look at. It's a very nasty fate. And as I said, it was done by the Romans as a way of trying to deter others and to shame the people who were actually up there. We won't go into small groups for this one. We thought we'd talk about this one in the larger group. What does it mean, do you think, that Jesus seemed to submit willingly to the public shame and humiliation of being crucified? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, there's a dignity in it, I think, and not running away from your principles, not running away from where you think God wanted you to be. There's a nobility in it, I feel.
I would agree with that, but I'd also probably think that outside of his followers, that would have been a rare point of view. They would have seen it as quite a shameful thing that happened. And that's why you have the mocking at the bottom of the cross of the crowd. he said he was the Son of God. Let's see if God saves him. You've got all these comments flying around that show people saw it as a shameful thing. I agree with you. It shows Jesus was very principled. He was prepared to die for what he believed in and what the right thing was. That probably wasn't largely shared about those who witnessed his death.
I've got a question about those who witnessed his death.
Yes.
Earlier today, at the beginning of this study session, I learned something from a piece of the scripture that I've never seen before in all my 70 years. And that is that Mark, I think it was in 10, talked about Gentiles, handing them over to the Gentiles.
Yes.
And I thought that the crowd that cried for his crucifixion were the Jews, his own people who he'd rubbed up the wrong way.
That's certainly true in the Gospel of Matthew. The crowd do cry for his blood. But what gets him arrested is the priests are in cahoots with the Romans. And before you think about I'll make a couple of points. Priests and Pharisees are not the same, and they didn't like each other. They're two very disparate groups in Judaism. And the priests were in cahoots with the Romans. The Romans were fairly universally hated, but the Romans appointed the priests. So the police have a very good political reason for supporting Romans and falling into step with what they want to do and making sure nothing threatens Roman power. So that's one point that's important. The second to consider is what actually gets Jesus arrested. Just put the Gospel of John aside for the moment, because I think John's doing something very different. With Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus is arrested because he comes trotting into Jerusalem in what is often called the triumphal march, on a donkey with crowds and all of the trappings of kingship, cloaks on the road, palms, and they're calling out Hosanna, which in Hebrew means save us, which if I'm a watching Roman soldier or centurion, I'm not probably going to take that too well. Save us from whom? Those terrible Romans, of course. And he's being hailed basically as a king. It's a Passover where the city is swelled to 3 or 4 times its normal size. They often have revolts of the zealots at this time. It's a highly volatile time. And Jesus comes storming into this and letting himself be hailed as king into Jerusalem. Of course, the Romans are going to crush him. So the handing over to the Gentiles probably refers to, I think, is the priests probably made sure that Jesus, and of course you have Judas is involved in this, that Jesus was in fact identified accurately and handed over to the Romans to be treated as someone who was stirring up sedition and treason. Does that answer your question?
Very well.
Struck this week by not anything to scale, of course, but how Navalny went back to Russia, knowing probably that entering a place where he would not be safe, where they tried to kill him, and that there was another consequence of that. So people do things for a cause, don't they, which is going to put their life at risk. Now, I'm not saying that Navalny is like Jesus or anything like that, but it's not uncommon for people to enter into risk.
Well, he's like Jesus in the sense that he walked into something that he knew in most probable circumstances would lead to his death.
Yes, Jesus knew it's going to happen. And Jesus, in here, the question, what does it mean? Jesus seemed to submit willingly. And I think he was not, my point of view, didn't think it as a humiliation or something like a Roman power crushing him. It is rather, I'm doing this willingly, and I trust in God's concerns and ways all my life. And this is the end. Probably this is end and beginning another new world to humanity. And he willingly submitted to this, but I don't think he thought this as a public shame or humiliation. And he was proud of to be this, to do this, to follow the God's way to the end, what God wanted him to do, and what God wanted him to walk this journey with people together and surrounded him, lots of people. And I don't think even some of the Jesus followers didn't think this is a shameful thing. This is the thing, I'm doing it, and to the end, and what God wants me to do. So it was not for him, I think for Jesus, it was not a shameful thing, not a humiliating thing. It is rather God's concern, God's proud. And that's God is, I'm pleased with you, do this what I want you to do. So that is God's kind of, I'm pleased with you.
Yeah, I think that, Jesus' point of view and that of his followers and those who wrote the Gospels didn't see it. You're right. They didn't see it as a humiliation or a shame. And they used the servant songs from Isaiah too. We often use them around Easter as readings, where it talks about, here is my servant who's all disformed and he's broken and he's these things. And you're going to beat him and do horrible things to him, but here's the one I'm pleased with. I think they understand it in the light of those writings. So it isn't a shame. It might be a shameful thing to everybody else, but God's taken that, as Paul says, and inverted it and made it a thing of great glory.
I think that the main thrust actually is that it was a public thing. I think that the key is that it was a witness thing, that there are so many layers that we look back on now and can see so much hypocrisy and so much actually turned out about faith. So I don't think he cared. He could have picked his own demise at any point in time and in fact walked away from them at several points during his ministry. But I think that this was the most public arena to express it.
It certainly was. You don't get much more public than crucifixion, because it was always done on the roads and crossroads where there was the heaviest amount of traffic, because the idea is to make these people an example.
But at the time there was shame for him. I think he felt absolutely terrible going through it because he felt God had abandoned him, didn't he?
Well, he did in Mark and Matthew. He doesn't in Luke and John. So the cries on the cross are different. They're the same in Matthew and Mark. My God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah. But in Luke and John, we have things like, into your hands I commend my spirit, or it is finished, which is not the same at all as the cry of abandonment. So that's another puzzle that we'll come to a little bit later on. Sharon, did you want to say something?
It also provided exact proof that he had died. The splitting of the water and the blood is evidence of death. One as Athanasius, somebody did a huge treatise on this to show this is 3 days showing that he's actually died. Elizabeth is saying if he'd gone away somewhere else by himself, people could say, oh no, he only faked it. And here he is back again for real, as opposed to dead and resurrected.
Yeah, that's a reasonable point. You can't have a really triumphant resurrection unless you've got a very dead Jesus. So, yeah, that's a fair point, because obviously there were rumours that the disciples stole the body, or they stole Jesus before he was dead and he was somehow revived, and that's how he came back. We know that. The Gospel of Matthew tells us rumours like that are circulating around, so that's a reasonable. All right, we might move on to the next part now, which segues from this, about take up your cross and lose your life. So Jesus talks about, I guess this is a prophetic word about his faith. And he says, if any of you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up your cross, follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will save it. So there's a lot of paradoxes going on here. So to save your life, you need to lose it. You don't want to gain the whole world, because that forfeits your life. And the implication is gaining the world means things like mortal power and prestige or wealth or popularity. And Jesus specifies, he knows it's shameful what he's about to do, or that it will be perceived as shameful. Because he said, when he says, take up your cross and lose your life, he then declares, those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, I will also be ashamed of them when the Son of Man comes in his glory and Father with the holy angels. So this indicates that this shame aspect is Mark, the author, and perhaps Jesus, is really aware of what he's doing and how it will be perceived, and that it is a shameful thing. So it's a paradox. To gain honour, Jesus has to be subjected to the shame of the cross. And likewise, to gain honour as following Jesus as a disciple, a person must pick up this shameful instrument of death at the cross and lay aside any desire for kind of power here and there where they are, give up any claim on life itself, and live as a servant, as Jesus later says, be willing to be dishonoured for the sake of the shame of the gospel. Remember, we're in an honour-shame culture here, meaning that, if you shame someone, it's probably much more terrible than it is for us. There are honour-shame cultures in our world, like Japan is one, Korea is another, and there are others. So Jesus is really turning things upside down here.
Yeah.
All the things that are shameful are suddenly honourable. So we have a question for you to talk about it. And this is in regards to you. These are pretty tough words, I think. Take up your cross and lose your life to gain it. So we're asking you to talk about, what does it mean then for us to take up our cross? How do we actually do that? Okay, how did you go with this question now about what does it mean to take up your cross?
Keep giving us these easy questions. Why don't you try and challenge us through?
Hello.
Thank you for that, Bill. Especially for us in the Western world, as we live our reasonably comfortable lifestyles. What does it mean when we say take up your cross?
Henrietta had a good perspective on that on the Malaysian, where she's from. So I don't know if Henrietta, you want to add to that?
Yeah, like there's a pastor in Malaysia who has been, disappeared for about 3 or 4 years now, and his family don't know what's happened to him. And there's another pastor and his wife who were just taken away, and they know they know the dangers, and they're still taking up the cross and doing preaching and doing things that they are doing. That's why I say in this country we are comfortable. Yeah, it's different things in different countries about taking up the cross.
Well, we're safe here, aren't we?
Yeah.
There's not many things that are going to get us thrown in jail. I mean, apart from obvious violations of law like assault and murder and arson and theft, we've got all of those sorts of things. But mostly we're free to protest. That's getting a bit more difficult now, especially if you're an environmental protester. You're much more likely to end up in court or with fines and jail time. If you protest coal mines or shipping ports and that kind of thing, or trees being logged. But what does it mean for us when we take up our cross? Do we have any concept of it?
I feel that it is a ministry, that all of us are called to ministry, particular sorts, and that it changes as we grow older. And we have to listen to God's call about where God is calling us, and there will be loss involved in that, leaving an old way of life, embracing a new perhaps. And also for our church, I think our church is called to take up the cross and follow Jesus, and that may probably will mean leaving behind old identities, old social identity, old ways of doing things, and embracing other ways of reaching out to a culture which is very different from what it used to be. And there, while we're not in physical danger, there is pain involved in that, and there is loss involved in that. So I think I think we have to interpret this for our particular circumstances, which are differ from country to country, obviously.
Yeah. Well said. Anyone want to comment on what Elizabeth just said?
I think it's entirely true what she said, and I think the churches tends not to do these things because it's been so convenient to go on doing the things they've been doing in the past, which are not working, and they're all getting smaller.
Yes. I notice there's a lot of ministers in this group who have been very quiet about this, but they probably agree with that.
They shouted hallelujah. I'm not a minister though.
We have a group called Australian Churches Australian Churches Refugee Task Force of the NCCA. I'm part of that. We are about 22 of us. All of us work on the ground with the asylum seekers, refugees from various churches, from various states. And this is one of the things that we want to pass it on to the rest, every congregation, just the way that was shared by Elizabeth. It is a church's call to carry the cross as well, and to be with the vulnerable people, and to be their voice, to be their prophetic voice, and to face even shame and rejection by those who don't agree with them. I shared in my group my story about Elizabeth, and John knows. We left Sri Lanka. We actually fled Sri Lanka. I was the human rights chair and the human rights advocate in Trincomalee, 3 years in that place, and challenged the 4 heads of forces, brought them to the church and questioned them with the help of a few people who joined me. But people were frightened to face those fellows in uniforms. But I kept talking because violence was unleashed on innocent people, and someone had to talk, someone had to take up the challenge. And I started speaking in public, in big meetings with government agents and others involved, and also Buddhist monks and Sinhalese, almost thugs in the meeting. And they wanted to cut my throat if I slept in the night. I'd sleep outside, and then the next day I'm all over the place. And it went on, and then they gave me the ultimatum to get me on the 1st of January 1984. So, but I took it up as a challenge, because I felt that if Jesus was there in my place, what will he do? And that's how I didn't think in terms of carrying the cross at that time. I wanted to do what I could do on that particular day, and ask for justice and stop violence. So I would have been the first clergy to go missing in Sri Lanka. After me, there are a few went missing, including missionaries who raised their voice. So another 3 years I survived, and in another place, and we left the country because our little boy was almost dying in a crossfire with convulsion. We had to think twice, and Shanti resigned from the bank in a big job, and we left, and that's how we came in 87 to Australia, 86 in Australia.
Well, thanks for sharing that, John. What you mightn't have picked up, John was one of the original boat people that came when Australia still had a heart and welcomed boat people. And I think it's a great story to exemplify someone taking up their cross.
Yeah.
And carrying it in today's world when so much around you threatened you, John. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope you all found that an inspiring story for yourselves to take away and ponder.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Josh. Thank you.
Josh, they call it you, man. He sort of said.
This might be a bit controversial, but I've been doing that a lot lately. I'd argue that a lot of churches, not just Uniting Churches, but churches in general in the West, aren't willing to take up their cross and to take on the challenge of a changed society and the need to do church differently. Was it Pierce mentioned churches getting smaller because they're not willing to, they just want to keep doing the same convenient old thing, and they're not willing to take up their cross to meet the challenge of meeting the needs of the community and the people that surround them.
Yeah.
That's about we unite as a uniting church, and we are one of the most prophetic, and they carry the cross, carry the people's concern, carries God's concern, and God's concern in our community, and the people like John just mentioned, and refugees, and people homeless, and people who are struggling, and all sort of conditions. We connect with them. This
Well,
is
there are churches that do that really well.
This is our cross. This is our God's concern, and God's concern and human concern, most vulnerable people. And this is our cross we carry.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of churches that do that really well, both uniting and other denominations. But I've also seen a lot of churches that kind of have buried their heads in the sand and said, oh, it's all too hard. Don't understand those young people or those refugees or whatever.
I think you're right. I think John and I have been in presbytery positions across a very broad swathe of this country, including Western Australia. And there is a reluctance to change with many of our churches. And don't be offended if you're from a rural area. If I'm going to say something that you might not like, but I find rural churches much harder to shift than ones who are in suburbia. That's not always true, but we're finding, we're in a rural church again, not as ministers, we're retired here, and they're very distrustful of change.
Even
doesn't
moving
mean they
the
can't.
seats is difficult.
Yeah,
it is difficult. Yeah.
I just think it's occurring in city churches as well, that people are reluctant to change, that something has worked for them for endless time. I actually am part of two churches that combined to form a new congregation, but it's very much dominated by one of those two congregations, at least I think it is. And it's a congregation that, if you try doing something different, they get upset and can object. And I find this very difficult.
Yeah, it is. Greg, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I've been intrigued by our focus on mission. It seems that mission's the thing we're at. I'm also cynical enough, and I can say this now as one whose income doesn't depend on it, that it seemed to be by the energy for mission was directly proportional to the diminution of the size of the congregations.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the message of having big congregations is actually supplanted the message of the gospel. But it seemed that Jesus only had a few, not that many people. And we've grown up in a heyday I grew up in a church that had, big congregations. Now it hasn't. I'm not convinced that that's such a bad thing. Of course, you can't do what we did 40 years ago, but maybe we don't need such a big, cumbersome organisation to carry the message on. So, I just wonder if we need to be more honest with the fact that our focus on mission is our focus on the institution and not upon being transformational rather than being salvific.
It ought to be both, I would answer to that.
Yeah,
we should be disciples and we should be on mission, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should be saving the institution either, which I think is a fair point for you to make.
Of a Sunday lunchtime in the park for people that, there was one person that struggles to get up Sunday mornings, and I totally know the feeling. Actually, there's two that are just not morning people. Some others were reluctant to enter a church because they're worried that the roof would fall in. And there's a real range of people that came, but I had kind of a kids bit. And then from whatever the text I used for the kids bit, emerged discussion with the adults. And there was no right or wrong answers. It was just what does this mean to you? What do you think of that? That sort of thing. And I haven't done it this year, but that was working quite well. Much better than having 3 hymns, a sermon, announcements, prayers for others, all the rest of it.
Our liturgies are very arcane in the sense that most people, if they're not churched, find them strange.
Yeah.
And difficulty in actually really immersing themselves in them or engaging themselves in them.
Yeah.
I mean, there are ways you can work with that. But I think it is a fair thing to say that our church has evolved too slowly.
Yes.
And whoever said it, it might have been Sherry or somebody said it, appears when the things that have served us well for decades are no longer serving us well in many contexts.
Right.
And we do need to evolve, whatever that looks like. And we don't need to evolve just to prop up the institution and pay Greg super, or mine and John's super for that matter. We're here because we're supposed to be relevant, and we're supposed to be bringing good news, and we're supposed to be a transformative group of people. And I'm not sure we're fulfilling that destiny in the best way we possibly could at this point in time.
And I think it will look different for different groups, different areas. I think having one standard liturgy is probably an approach that's not going to work into the future.
No, you have to be flexible about this stuff. And you have to think about what it means to someone who's not church walking into your organisation and walking into a hymn or walking into the announcements or walking into something that's very strange that they don't know what's going on, and actually give thought to this and what it looks like and what it means. And perhaps we should be all thinking about how we actually take up the challenge, or the cross, if you like, of what do we look like to outsiders, and what can we do to actually engage them in a way that is transformative for them and conveys the good news.
I think too that part of the way that we do things is part of our deep identity, especially those of us who've been in the church for years and years, maybe our whole life. We have our personal identity, we have our social identity, which is the groups that we belong to, the shared ways of doing things, the shared values, the shared history. And this is part of human nature. And what we're asking, what this take up your cross and follow me and die as Jesus died, we have to die to this, our actual deep social identity. And I think our people need to be helped to understand a theology about social identity and about what taking up a cross is no mean thing. A cross is awful. It's hard. It's painful. But there is resurrection and God is with us. And I think that's got to be, it's not easy to preach that to people, to say they're going to suffer, but any group that changes suffers.
Yeah, they do. Change is not easy. It's always going to be painful. There's a saying I quite like that might help you. Tradition is the preservation of fire, not the worship of ashes.
Very good.
So that might be I'll get John to send it out with the next set of notes for you. It's worth remembering. We might just spend the last few minutes. John's going to talk about the end of this passage, which is the beginning of the next chapter, because it is a tricky thing.
The verse that I said the lectionary quite naughtily leaves out is a hard word, a difficult word. Truly, I tell you, says Jesus, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come in power. In other words, the kingdom is coming before some of these people here die, he says, in the year 33, presumably, of the Common Era. It's a saying that has links with what Jesus says when he's before the Sanhedrin. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And Jesus there is, of course, quoting scripture to the priests and the Pharisees in that discussion there. It also connects with what he says in the teaching he gives his disciples in chapter 13, the so-called apocalyptic discourse. This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will not pass away. So there's a sense in what Jesus is saying that things are going to happen, if not immediately, certainly very soon. Quite clearly, if we take the plain sense of these words, before this generation has died out, the Son of Man will come, the kingdom will come with power. So the dilemma is, if Jesus said this, why didn't it come true? Why didn't it actually happen well and truly in the first century? Why are we still holding on, waiting? And also, if later followers of Jesus knew that he said it and it was not fulfilled, why did they continue to remember and retell it, even decades, generations, centuries after Jesus said it? We've still got it in our scripture. But it seems to be a word of Jesus that did not come true, if you like. We've just got a couple of minutes to toss that around together.
Any thoughts?
Was this actually said by Jesus? That's the first question I'd like to know. The other thing is that I think that in a sense it did occur, because although Jesus was killed, the disciples, however many there were, continued to preach what he was preaching, and they developed an embryo church, which has had its time when it's grown and time when it's shrinking, as it is at the moment. So
that
I think that I think we're taking this piece of wording too literally.
So you're wanting to equate this kingdom coming, the kingdom of God coming with power, to the early church and the preaching of the kingdom that the I spread around the Mediterranean basin.
Oh,
yes, I would, but I think that
I
think that the church has made a bad job of it sometimes. I mean, Constantine ruined the church, I reckon.
Let's not jump too far.
Agree.
Greg.
Can I ask a question? Mark,
sure.
And when was Mark writing this, bearing in mind that the temple was destroyed about the 70th year of the first century? And was that some sort of encouragement to the original audience of Mark? Or is it relevant?
The authorship of Mark is thought to be somewhere between 60 and 70. It may have just been before the temple was destroyed, Greg.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't give the explicit references like you find in Luke and John that the temple has been destroyed.
Right.
I think the best guess for that is that Mark's writing towards the end of that 60 to 70 period. The uprising against the Romans gets ahead of steam in the year 66. By the year 70, the Zealots are in the temple surrounded by the Romans and they burn the temple. And by the year 74, the Romans have completely subdued the uprising. So there's that period, 66 to 74, but particularly 66, 67, 68, 69, before the ultimate destruction of the temple. But in the heat of the battle, Jesus symbolically sitting outside the temple and saying these terrible things are going to happen, must have resonated really strongly with his audience, with Mark's audience, if that was the time that he was writing. That's what I think is best guess.
Yeah, I guess I'm tacitly suggesting that Jesus didn't say it, and Mark.
Mark massages Jesus' words for that period of time. For that.
Yeah, that's possible. All three synoptics report this. Matthew says it twice. And Matthew's even more explicit about what he understands the kingdom of God coming with power. And I hate to disappoint you, Piers, but it's not the early church. It's an apocalyptic vision of the Son of Man on clouds with his angels on the day of judgment, sorting people into good and bad. So the early church as the kingdom is not going to wash in the light of that. Your first question about did Jesus say it, I actually think he did. And why do I think this? I think that he said it because the synoptic writers preserved it. Why would you preserve something Jesus didn't say that didn't happen? You'd only preserve it if Jesus actually said it, surely. So it's important, even if it doesn't seem to have come true. So I actually think Jesus did say it. And I think he just got it wrong. So there, you can all hate me now.
That sounds quite reasonable for me.
I think I've thought about this a lot as a classical historian. I've thought about it a lot. And that is the conclusion I've come to. You don't preserve sayings that haven't come true unless they were actually said by the person. And if you read the prophets, like Isaiah 2 is classic with what he predicts or he says is going to happen in the immediate future as part of the return of the exiles to Judea. Very little of that actually came to pass, but it's still preserved because the prophet said it.
Yeah.
And as Jews, that doesn't trouble Jews the way it might trouble us. They just deal with it and find other ways to metaphorically interpret it.
Just to say that next week, after all the difficulties and tensions and challenges of this week, we enter a nice, gentle,
overturn the tables.
Overturn the tables. And
I love this story. It's a great story.
We're looking at the version of this in John's Gospel because that's what the lectionary offers. But Elizabeth and I can't help ourselves, as those of you who've done studies with us before know. So we will be putting alongside that the version in Mark, which is the lectionary Gospel that we've skipped away from for a moment. So the material that you'll get next week will ask a whole series of questions about Mark's and John's versions of the incident in the temple, overturning the tables.
So for homework, we suggest you read them side by side in advance, and you'll see what we're talking about. There are some quite distinct differences. And John's picked a lovely medieval Jesus there to show you, doing his whipping in the temple in his medieval peasant garb, throwing out medieval moneylenders.
Yes, that's right. Okay, that's next week.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming today and for your participation. It's been a great discussion. Great to have you all here, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.